Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you've joined us from, and welcome to our final session here at the Global Deal High-Level Annual Social Dialogue Forum. My name is Nozipho Shabalala, and it's been an absolute privilege to have journeyed with all of you over the last 4 days. And in these 4 days, we've taken time to pause and really sink our teeth into the theme that has really anchored our conversations. We've been looking beyond the pandemic and looking at social dialogue and how it can shape the new labor market. We've taken different elements of that theme and really gone into depth around them. Now, yesterday in particular, we spent a lot of time addressing inequalities and looking at this through the lens of due diligence. Some of the very interesting insights that came out of the session yesterday was the importance of due diligence as a problem-solving tool that allows us to identify, to mitigate, and to prevent human rights abuses in value chains. We also yesterday spoke a lot about the importance of information and data that allows businesses to be able to react to some of the abuses that might be prevalent in their value chains, and the significance of due diligence in making that happen. Of course, there was a very robust conversation around the need to transition from voluntary due diligence to mandatory due diligence, and we heard some compelling examples of how this has been done and can be done. And at the core of the conversation yesterday was how due diligence really becomes one of the most important building blocks to build trust and to build accountability among social partners. And so we're building on all of the themes that have been coming out throughout the week, including some of these insights that came out from yesterday. Today, we find ourselves engaging around the theme of the double disruption. We're looking at social dialogue in the context of digitalization and in the context of COVID-19. And we're going to follow a similar format to what we followed in the last 3 days. We're going to kick off with some opening remarks. We're then going to transition and make our way to some scene setting remarks. And then we're going to take all of that and pull it into the panel discussion. The panel discussions have been robust, they've been insightful, but they've been even richer because of your participation, ladies and gentlemen. So allow me once again to extend that invitation to you to say, please send us your questions, send us your comments through the chat, and we will integrate your voice into this conversation. I also know that there's been a lot of activity on social media. So those who are going to be tweeting and sharing some of these insights on across all social media platforms, just a reminder that we're using 2 hashtags, hashtag Global Deal Forum and hashtag Social Dialogue. As always, we have interpretation in English, French, and Spanish. And so we really encourage you to follow this conversation in the language that is most comfortable to you. And allow me to say this before we get started, that your voice in this forum is critically important to us. It is your contribution to the global deal, and we know that your voice can make a difference. So let's exercise it and claim our share of voice. It's been an absolute privilege to see partners coming together, the social partners coming together from government, from business, from trade unions, not only participating in the conversation, but leaning into the global deal in the way that we've seen this week. And so, without further ado, I'm going to invite us to enjoy this short message that comes, of course, from Mr. Matthias Cormann. He is the 6th Secretary General of the OECD. And prior to his appointment, we know that he served as Australia's Finance Minister, as well as the Leader of Government in the Australian Senate, and as a federal senator representing the state of Western Australia. In these roles, we know Mr. Cormann from being a very, very strong advocate for the positive power of open markets, of free trade, and the importance of a rules-based international trading system. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, let's receive these remarks.
Ministers, colleagues, I'm pleased to address this session on double disruption, social dialogue, digitalization, and COVID-19 at the Global Deal Annual High-Level Social Dialogue Forum. This event comes at a critical juncture for the world. The COVID-19 pandemic has taken a terrible toll, with millions of lives lost and long-lasting health impacts. It has wreaked havoc on the world economy, hitting the livelihoods of countless people. And it is not over, though it could have been, and we feared that it would have been worse. Worse outcomes have been avoided. The economic recovery is underway, economic growth continues to pick up, and the economic outlook continues to improve. We have been consistently upgrading our projections for GDP ever since the middle of 2020, with global economic growth now expected to reach 5.7% this year and 4.5% in 2022. Extensive policy support combined with the unexpectedly rapid development of effective vaccines, combined with the accelerating digital transformation of our economies, all contributed to this more optimistic outlook. Yet the recovery remains uneven across countries and sectors. New outbreaks of the virus remain our biggest risk. We need to continue to pursue an all-out effort to reach the entire world population with vaccines as quickly as possible. No country will be truly protected until everyone around the world is appropriately protected. The unemployment rate has fallen from its 8.8% peak in April 2020 to 6.2% in July 2021, although it remains a full percentage point higher than before the crisis. As we recover, we are also called to address the structural changes brought forward by the digital transformation. Over the past 3 years, for example, demand for employees with artificial intelligence skills doubled in the US, Australia and the UK, and almost tripled in Canada, India, Indonesia and Brazil. To address the double disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic and the accelerating digital transformation, we need to support the growth of firms and jobs with a viable future in this new environment, while also supporting people through these transitions. It means expanding and improving active labour market policies, which includes investing in effective skills policies with a particular focus on upskilling and reskilling, promoting a culture of lifelong learning and addressing participation bottlenecks. It also means promoting job quality through the digital transformation. Artificial intelligence can improve job quality by automating tasks that are mentally or physically stressful or even dangerous. But if not checked, it can also pose risks, for example, through intrusive monitoring and workload intensification, where workers end up having to work more for the same pay. This brings me to the central question of today's Global Deal Forum. What is the role of social dialogue in addressing these opportunities and challenges? First, social dialogue is important in complementing active labour market policies in upskilling and reskilling of workers and promoting job quality. For example, the collective agreement for the telecommunications sector in Italy set up a solidarity fund financed by companies and workers, which will be used to retrain and reskill workers. It will also provide incentives for voluntary departures and compensation to workers in the event of job cuts, as well as incentives for voluntary departures. In France, the new scheme called Transition collective, collective transitions, combines flexibility and security by allowing workers at risk of becoming unemployed to retrain for hard-to-fill jobs, while keeping the contract with the existing employer. Second, social dialogue can help with the introduction of new technologies that are both pragmatic and fair, and which accounts for the interests of both workers and businesses. For example, recent research finds that workplaces that have worker representation and are covered by collective bargaining are more advanced when it comes to using robots in production. Social dialogue is important in our efforts to recover from the COVID-19 crisis. Rest assured that the OECD, in partnership with the Global Deal, will continue to champion social dialogue and ensure it becomes a central part of our efforts as we design, develop and deliver better policies for better lives. Let us continue to work together towards a strong, resilient, green and inclusive recovery. I wish you a lively, positive and successful conversation. Thank you.
It's a very big thank you to the Secretary General and very clearly and succinctly speaking to the opportunity and the potential of social dialogue to really help us to navigate change and to navigate the transitions that we find ourselves in. And so Allow me then to very quickly transition us to our scene-setting remarks that are going to be delivered by Professor Valerio De Stefano from the University of Leuven. He is of course, professor of labor law in Belgium, where he leads a team of researchers working on labor and on technology, artificial intelligence, which the Secretary General has spoken about and touched on. At work, he also looks at work and platform work. He holds a PhD in law of business and commerce from Bocconi University, and he's also previously worked as an officer of the International Labour Office in Geneva, as well as a practitioner of labor law. Professor De Stefano, the floor is yours. We're keen to lean into your scene-setting remarks, and we know that they're going to give us a lot of input for the conversation that's to follow.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure and honor to be with you today. So my presentation is going to be about one of the focus of the future focus of social dialogue, which in my opinion is going to be and must be algorithmic management. So any form of management and the use of AI and AI-enabled technology to manage and discipline the workforce. This is something that is, as the Secretary General just pointed out, is skyrocketing in our societies, in our labor markets at the moment, and poses a lot of challenges, both ethical, legal, and social. And why it is that? It is because algorithmic management at the moment doesn't function in the way that it should, in the way of automating dangerous and boring jobs, but it much more functions as a way of automating managers' jobs and to basically discipline the workforce. We can have several examples of that. We all know the way platform workers, for instance, are directed to one job to the next and monitored through the use of GPS. But GPS is also used heavily in logistics to monitor how long a worker takes to complete a task and to direct them to the next job, and to start, for instance, giving warnings if the worker moves too slowly, and if basically the performance of the worker doesn't correspond to the metrics of the algorithm, they risk being terminated or disciplined. This kind of technology is also used to heavily monitor people at work, for instance, by collecting conversations, not recording the content of the conversation, but collecting metadata such as the tone of voice to determine whether a certain person is stressed, or to whom certain workers talk or not talk at the office, and then to take action in that sense. This is particularly invasive, as it is extremely invasive the use of facial scanning during interviews in order to determine whether a job candidate, for instance, is lying during a job interview, or somebody during a meeting is paying attention or not. On top of being particularly invasive, these technologies tend to be also extremely inaccurate and tend also to discriminate against vulnerable groups and women in the labor market. So this poses all sorts of challenges, particularly when AI is used or pretend to be used to detect emotions and also to predict future behavior, also by the use of big data. During the pandemic, we have seen the skyrocketing access from employers to proctoring devices that monitor remote workers, tracking how many keystrokes they give in a certain period of time, or how many mouse movements they do, or secretly spying their browsing activity, taking random screenshots to basically assess whether they're working or not, when they work from remote. This was already present in our labor markets, but again, during the pandemic, the shift to remote work has also led many companies to start panic buying or panic leasing many of these instruments without, in most of the cases, knowing how these systems properly work and what is in these systems. And this poses a lot of ethical, but also particularly stringent legal challenges to the regulators and also, of course, to the social partners. It is not just about privacy, it's also about enhanced health and safety risk, because all this heavy monitoring can enhance psychosocial risk and stress for workers. As I said, it is particularly at risk of discrimination, and it also can be used for anti-union practices, and actually it has been used to target unions in workplaces. So it is spreading across sectors. It is not just confined in the logistics, in platform work. We see instances of this in the banking sector, in the finance sector, in the service sector. It is basically starting to be a sort of tech dystopian pandemic that was in a way prompted by the real pandemic. And it's extremely important that action is taken now. What is the role of social dialogue in this? As I said, many employers bought these devices, these tools, this software, or leased this software without even knowing whether they were legal and how they properly work. I think it is time to open for a season of social dialogue and vetting of these instruments, both retroactively and proactively, also with the help of, in case of non-compliance, of administrative sanctions. Why is it important to do this now? It is important because the more we proceed on this way, the more it's going to be difficult to roll these things back. And it is not just because all these systems pose very important threats to the human dignity and to fundamental labor rights, but it also poses fundamental threats to businesses, and particularly small and medium enterprises who don't know what they actually using in their software, and sit on potential liabilities that could destroy them in the going forward. So it is extremely important that authorities take the lead on this and promote social dialogue, which is basically the safest, the most tailored way of addressing this thing at the workplace, at the sectoral level, in negotiation between unions, employee association, and individual employers. Only social dialogue can do that. And let me also stress one thing that it might sound probably superfluous in this panel, but it's very important. We cannot rely just on NGOs to do this kind of advocacy work. This is not just something that pertains to a realm, the realm of privacy, the realm of discrimination, the realm of OSH. We have to take an holistic approach to address all these challenges, and labor unions and employer associations are there to address all these challenges as they have done in the past. They can actually do this in the future. So it is extremely important to trust the social partners and to empower them to basically ensure that this technology is used for the best, and basically all the dystopian ways of using it get rolled back. I go to the conclusion. The pandemic has also shown that our social compact is a risk of being cracked, also because our labor protection are mostly designed to cover employees, leaving a lot of people who are outside the scope of the employment relationship, outside the scope of protection. Being them bogus self-employed or genuine self-employed, many of those people fell between the cracks of protection during the pandemic. They didn't have proper access to occupational health and safety. In many cases, if we think of casual workers and platform workers, they were not covered by employment laws, but they also weren't properly covered by the emergency reliefs that were put in place to defend the regular self-employed, the traditional self-employed. So it is extremely important that we go towards universality of protection. And this also is extremely important when it comes to algorithmic management. Platforms, businesses don't distinguish between employees and the self-employed when they put in place these forms of algorithmic management and these forms of algorithmic disciplining of workers. This is why social dialogue needs to go beyond its usual boundaries. It really needs to expand to new areas, also to cover every worker without regard to their employment status. And I close here. I thank you again very much for inviting me to set the scene today.
Professor De Stefano, thank you very much. These are certainly very eye-opening remarks that you've shared. Algorithmic management and how social dialogue becomes such a critical tool that allows and empowers social partners to really come into that space and vet these instruments, to paraphrase a word that you've used. Now, before we go into the panel discussion, I do want to maybe just take a moment to invite Minister Eva Nordmark. She has a few words that she would like to share with us. And from there, we're then going to pull a lot of what we've heard from Professor De Stefano, what we've heard from the Secretary General, and we're going to ready ourselves for a robust panel discussion with your voice, of course, included. For now, Minister, the floor is yours.
Dear colleagues, distinguished panelists, let me just take a minute to carry out my condolences of my deceased friend, Richard Trumka, president of the AFL-CIO. It was with great sadness I got the news that he passed away in the beginning of August. Over the years, in my earlier position as the president of the Swedish Confederation of Professional Employees, I met with Mr. Trumka many times at Oecd and in ITUC. Mr. Trumka was a firm spokesperson of workers' rights, democracy, and not the least of social dialogue nationally and globally. He strongly believed in the empowerment of social partners coming together to find solutions to global challenges through dialogue. And I would like to quote his words: "The survival of democracy anywhere depends on working people to defend it everywhere. The truth is democracy and the labor movement are one and the same." End of quote. The global labor movement has lost a giant, a strong and unique voice for the workers around the world. His legacy of empowering workers around the world will carry on for generations to come. My thoughts are with his family and friends and comrades of AFL-CIO. Thank you.
Minister Nordmark, thank you very much. A very important pause in our program, and thank you very much for creating the space for us to do that. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as we transition into our panel discussion, let us be reminded that we're bringing into sharp focus the double disruption. On the one hand, we know that labor markets are struggling to build back pre-pandemic numbers of jobs. And then on the other hand, we also know that there are challenges with transitioning workers into new types of roles, into new types of jobs that, of course, has been created by the structural changes that have been brought about by COVID-19. This is the context through which we're going into this conversation. And of course, we're building on what we've heard Professor De Stefano speak about, and the role of social dialogue in navigating these very difficult developments that are now prevalent in the workspace, and also, of course, building on what we've heard from the Secretary General as we latch onto social dialogue to navigate the change. And so with that, allow me now, just as part of the panel, to introduce Minister Nordmark, who we've just heard. Of course, Minister Eva Nordmark is the Minister of Employment from Sweden. We are also joined by Minister Claudio Omar Moroni, who is, of course, the Minister of Labor, Employment and Social Security in Argentina. Minister, thank you very much for being here with us. We're joined by Mr. Jean-Pierre Clamadieu, the Chairman of ANGI. Thank you very much, sir, for being here with us. We're looking forward to tapping into your insights. We're joined by Madame Esther Lynch. She is the Deputy General Secretary at ETUC, that is, of course, the European Trade Union Confederation. Esther, lovely to have you with us and looking forward to your contributions. And we also have with us Madame Sabina Dewan. She is the President and Executive Director of Just Jobs Network. Sabina, thank you for being here, and we look forward to your remarks as well. And so maybe let me kick off with Minister Nordmark as we kick off this conversation. Minister, how is social dialogue in Sweden handling the pandemic, accelerating the pace of structural and digital change? And I'm also particularly interested, Minister, in how social partners in Sweden are supporting workers as they move from jobs that exist to jobs that are still being created.
Dear moderator Nosy and dear General Secretary and panelists and audience, social dialogue and collective bargaining have played an instrumental role in policy development in Sweden for decades. The social partners in Sweden, they have always had an open mind to new technology solutions, be it the transition to green technology or to platform-based employment. The mindset is that we must protect people, not jobs. Or as a trade union leader once said to me, Eva, I'm not afraid of the new technology, I'm afraid of the old technology, and that we will not be able to compete for the new jobs. The social partners know the importance of embracing structural change, not at least when it comes to the transition to green jobs. It's crucial for both businesses and trade unions that workers have the right tools, skills, and knowledge to take the new jobs. Especially in times of crisis, social dialogue plays a key role in absorbing shocks, preserving employment and supporting transition. In this new reality, the importance of an effective social dialogue and sound industrial relations has become even stronger during the pandemic, I would say. The government, together with the social partners in Sweden, took swift measures to adapt to the new reality during the pandemic. The social partners negotiated for hundreds of emergency agreements that support short-term work, and several 100,000 people have been saved from being dismissed from their jobs thanks to the collective agreements on short-term work. These agreements were made at the same time as the social partners negotiated new long-term collective agreements that regulate salaries for over 3 million workers in Sweden, a clear majority of the total workforce. And not one single day was lost in industrial action during these immense negotiations, not one single day during 2020. I would also like to mention that the social partners in Sweden have for the past 10 years been negotiating about a new deal for employment protection and skills support. The social partners have so-called job security councils, and these councils, which are based on collective agreements and financed by the employers, take responsibility for supporting the individuals through these structural changes on the labor market. They can offer training and validations of competence at an early stage to prevent displaced workers from becoming unemployed. The social partners negotiations have now resulted in an agreement on security, reskilling, and education and employment protection. The agreement means even better possibilities for workers to reskill and upskill. An employee who has been working for a period of 8 years will now get the possibility to participate in education at all levels for up to a year with 80% of their salary. And this is the largest reform on the Swedish labor market in modern times, actually. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much. And I think, when you started your contribution, it triggered me to remind our audience of our hashtags, because I think definitely if we are tweeting anything today, one of those sound bites came right at the beginning: protecting people and not jobs, which I thought was so important. It's hashtag Global Deal Forum, hashtag social dialogue. And Minister, thank you very much for giving us some practical examples of what social dialogue amongst the social partners has actually delivered. Minister Moroni, allow me to come to you, because we know that tripartite social dialogue was used very early on in the pandemic in Argentina, in particular to avoid redundancies and to pay private sector workers who could not work because of the pandemic, and to try and pay them at least 75% of their wages. Minister, the question to you is, moving forward now, has there also been social dialogue to agree on measures such as reskilling or the mobility support that help workers in moving into jobs that are now more viable? That transition that needs to happen. Minister, over to you.
Buenos días a todos y todas.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, indeed. In Argentina during the crisis, social dialogue allowed to preserve works that otherwise would have been lost. There was an agreement between the Work Confederation and Businesses Confederation to extend the periods and the 75% salary cover. That was applied to a 12% of the total workforce that could keep their contracts. Otherwise, those contracts would have been lost, and it would have been difficult to replace those workers and put them back to work after the first pandemic situation, that it was really sudden and abrupt. We keep the social dialogue open. Now on training, let me tell you that the first thing we did was to create a tripartite council to determine the contents of the training. We all know that the new jobs, new positions require a growing number of skills. I don't know if this is a global phenomenon, but in Argentina, there's some mismatch between the formal education system and the labor market needs. That made that created a situation that was where it was needed to determine the needs, the position needs. And this is what we did in a general council. And then we created sector councils where we work analyzing the needs in each sector, the demands in the work market concerning the workers' skills. And according to that, we develop training programs. There's another concept that we have integrated. I believe that nowadays the transmission of knowledge goes through very different channels. There's not only one way to transmit knowledges and skills to workers or the youth, as it was before through the formal education system. Now we have many different ways, many different channels. We have internet, we have trainings coming from abroad, and now the famous university degree that was handed after following a number of years of studies is not the only way. We are trying to take a stock of these different modalities of training and education, and through our sectorial councils, we also validate the knowledge that is acquired in the working place. So we are taking into account what the workers learn in their own jobs. What we are trying to avoid is to replicate a very structured system in the vocational training model that is not able to adapt at this fast speed evolution that we're living. The formal education system is a little bit stuck, and it is not ready to accelerate and to adapt to changes in evolution. And this is what we try to avoid in the professional vocation system. This is why we have a very different ways of transmitting knowledges and skills. Argentina had a very, very high unemployment rate, and we have many different programs that give income support to those that are out of job or have an informal job. And what we are doing is signing agreements between trade unions and other entities to make this kind of loans or subsidies, made them incentives for hiring. We have done that in the construction sector. We are doing that in hotels, restoration, etc. Very high working or demanding sectors, and we're trying to extend it to other sectors as well. So the general idea we're putting into place is to change the incentives, the classical incentives, into incentives for employers to hire new workers. And this is also done through social dialogue. We in Argentina, I would say 100% of wages depend on collective bargaining. even so in the public sector, where we also have collective bargaining. So it is not a compulsory system. It's not something we have to push for. It's something that comes naturally in the labor sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Moroni, and such a pertinent issue that you raise, the skills mismatch between the skills that are demanded by the labor market and the skills that are being churned out by traditional educational institutions. New ways of learning is one of the themes that you also spoke about, learning in the flow of work, which really speaks to the importance of social dialogue to really become the pathway that creates the space for all of these to take root and to be anchored. So thank you very much, Minister, and I'm hoping that we're going to be able to build on some of the ideas that you've put on the table. Allow me then to go to yourself, Jean-Pierre, and I really want us to take a look now into a corporate environment. Can you tell us how ENGIE is working together with worker representatives to address digital transformation?
Yes, I mean, I can share you a few insights from the shop floor, if I may use this analogy. So maybe just to set the scene, ENGIE is a pretty large utility, 160,000 employees around the world, strong focus in Europe, but also a strong presence in Latin America, especially Brazil. And I've always believed, as a manager, I've been managing companies for the last 20 years, probably. I've always believed that social dialogue is clearly an element which can improve our overall performance. Social dialogue is not just something you need to do because laws and regulations ask you to do that. I think we have to do it because it's a way to engage our employees and make sure that there is indeed a fruitful dialogue between the company and its workers. And we have at ENGIE a very active social dialogue, both at the national level, obviously France is our largest country, but also at the European level, and we have a very active European Works Council, and a lot of this dialogue, a lot of our efforts are focused on the European Works Council. In fact, we started in 2017, 2 years before the pandemic. We started a pretty comprehensive studies jointly with the European Works Council to try to understand what digitalization means, what digital transformation means for a company like ENGIE, what it means for its workers, and how we can make sure that we develop a very effective way to bring these digital tools into our organization. And in fact, in November 2019, just a few months before the first confinement, we have signed a joint statement with the European Works Council, which mentioned 6 key priorities when it comes to digitalization. The first one is the development of skills. And by the way, we'll see things that have been mentioned by other participants in this panel. So development of skills, first one, basic training to use digital tools. Second, support and coaching regarding new working methods, because when digital comes in, it's not just going from a notepad to a computer, it's clearly working differently. Reassertion of the importance of the quality of work life, quality of, people's environment, how do they feel when they are at work, is something which is very important for us. Respect for individual freedom, very important. Someone also touched on this because it creates a lot of worries from our employees, and we need to make sure that we can reassure them. IT security, and then extension of social dialogue around transformation project linked to the company digitalization. In some specific areas, digitalization brings very significant changes in the organization, and we need to make sure that these changes are being discussed with our social entities. The first priority coming out of this statement was a principle that each and every of our employees should have access to digital tool, which is not so simple because we have people on the ground working on the field, I would say, and giving them digital tool is not something very easy. In fact, the situation today is that out of our 160,000 people, 70% are connected, and the objective is to go to 100%. Well, this was, I mentioned that this charter was signed in November 2019. Then came the first confinement. And in a couple of days, we put more than 50,000 people in home office, very quick, very effective. And then we had kind of a real life test on how digitalization could impact our colleagues. And we have made sure during this period to use the social dialogue instances to monitor how this very quick and unexpected transformation was going on. And we've received a lot of feedback, which led to a number of corrective actions to make sure that we are adjusting as best as we can to this new working environment. So overall, I think a very high quality social dialogue within NG. We recognize that digitalization is a very important subject that we need to address in these instances. And unfortunately, the pandemic created a real life situation where we had to speed up very, very significantly our efforts. And I hope that we'll keep some good things out of this very challenging situation. And I'm pretty convinced that we've made some breakthrough progress in the way we use digital tools. Maybe we have an opportunity to come back in the next minutes of this panel on some very practical example on how digital has allowed us to continue to manage very effectively our organization and the competencies of our team workers during this period.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clamadieu. And I certainly hope we can come back, because I think you've raised a couple of things. One of the statements you've made is so consistent with what we heard from the president and CEO of Scania earlier on this week. And you spoke about social dialogue as a catalyst for performance. And I think he spoke about social dialogue as part of the strategic way of being competitive in the market. And so quite a lot of alignment that is coming out of that conversation. But also, as you're walking us through those 6 priority areas, I was keeping my eye on Professor De Stefano's face to see how he's reacting to what you're saying, and especially given, you know, some of the bad practice that he has highlighted for us earlier on in his scene setting remarks. But maybe from there, if I could just maybe have the opportunity to go to Esther. Esther, you know, one of the things that we do know is that the COVID-19 crisis really is resulting in increased job restructuring and collective redundancies. What, in your view, Esther, are the main criteria or guidelines for restructuring to be fair and for it to be equitable?
Thanks, Nosy. I think that leading successful change is harder than a lot of commentators think it is. Everybody who's been involved in it, everybody who's negotiated it for real knows it takes time, and an awful lot of what's in the management books, you know, just doesn't quite work when it comes to specific instances. But what we do know is one of the critical success factors is the hearts and minds of the workers. And how do you get those? You have and involve trade unions in managing the change, and always. So you don't just come and say to the union, well, this is the change process, and you go and sell it. You say, where do we need to get to? How can this organization get there? And from the workers' point of view, what are the critical factors that we need to involve? And I think that needs time, and it also needs leadership. And that's why I think it's so important, the discussion from the global deal community, to put down a strong marker that champions of effective change means involving trade unions and workers. And just a final point on that, because I know I only have a very, very short amount of time, is that the worker needs to understand in the totality of the change management process, how it will affect them. They need to know how will their job be affected. They need to know where their job will be at the end of the change process. And they need to know what's required of them to be successful for them personally in the change, but also for their workmates in getting to that change. And that needs support in terms of information. It's okay for a big firm. If you're a big company, you can probably afford the type of expert information you need to know what are the jobs going to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and what are the skills, and you can probably afford to pay for the training. But if you're a small or medium-sized firm, you're not going to be able to have that expertise in-house. And that's where I think governments come in. I think that's why we need great leaders like Eva Nordmark, who have the type of vision that's necessary to say, well, if we're going to support companies, we need to make sure that this is by collective bargaining, that we make sure that there's access to information on the type of skills that workers are going to need, and also that there is training available, real training available that people can genuinely access to succeed in the future. And my final point is, as a lot of the previous speakers have said, the reason there are 31 million people still in their jobs in Europe was because of the SURE initiative. That made resources available that allow for short-time work. And the enlightened employer, the enlightened government, will keep that scheme going and will target it more specifically around the management of the green transition, the management of the digital transition, so that people can have access to time off with pay for training for their job in the future. And that way everybody is a champion of change. Thanks, Nosy. Back to you.
Esther, really some excellent remarks here. Leading change is hard. And I think that's, that's one of the big takeaways from what I'm hearing. And you reminded me of comments that were made by Professor Anna yesterday, Mark Anna, where he spoke about the importance of inclusive and encompassing social dialogue. And what I'm hearing you saying is that this is not about handing over a change process that's already done and dusted, but it's actually about pausing and bringing in the voice of the union to input their fingerprints on that change process. The big question that we're hearing you saying is, at the end of the day, the worker is going to say, what does this mean for me? And that's the level of granularity that we really need to get to. So let me go to Sabina next. Sabina, I'm in Johannesburg, so I'm really interested in the global South as well in this conversation. Is the pandemic also accelerating the pace of digital change in work in the global South? And can you maybe give us a couple of good examples where social dialogue is succeeding in introducing new technologies in such a way that it is benefiting both the business, but also benefiting the worker too?
Yes, great. Thank you so much, Nosy, for that excellent question. And my thanks to the Global Deal for the invitation and really insightful remarks by all of the panelists. It's a pleasure to be here. I think the pandemic is accelerating the pace of technological change everywhere, in the global North as well as in the global South. But what is really important is to take note of the fact that the ability to cope with these changes is weaker in the global South. And I'd like to first lay out just a couple of reasons for why it's weaker. For example, in the global South, you have wider gaps between those that have access to technology and those that do not, right? As well as those that have requisite levels of education and skills to be able to use technology and those that do not. You have that, so that's point number one. The second is you have weaker safety nets, right? A lot of developing and emerging market economies have weaker institutions that do not have social safety nets, do not have active labor market policies. So in some sense, workers have less support in being able to adapt to the changes that technological advancement is bringing. And then the other point to note is that in a lot of these countries, you have significant downward pressure on labor markets already. So we know in Africa, in South Asia, a number of countries have what is often called a demographic dividend, or the fact that they have large and growing youth populations. But in the absence of enough jobs, in the absence of enough good jobs, these large and growing populations actually tend to become a liability because the economy is just not able to generate enough work for them to harness their productive potential. I think that in coming years, As the extent of the damage caused by the pandemic becomes apparent, we will see how the pandemic and the acceleration of technological change are deepening inequality between and within countries. And here, Nosy, I want to just address very quickly your point about social dialogue, which clearly has a critical role to play in fostering negotiation and communication between the social partners. But we have to recognize that in this new digital world, social protection is increasingly becoming linked from employment, which means that we have a larger growing group of self-employed workers that include, for example, contractors, self-employed contractors, gig workers, informal workers in informal employment. And it's really important to ensure that collective bargaining rights are extended to such workers, and that social dialogue also include models that account for these trends in representing a larger set of voices. So to echo Mark Anner, as you said, inclusive social dialogue both includes the importance of representing the voice of trade unions, robust trade unions in social dialogue, but equally in also ensuring that trade unions and that the voices of heterogeneous groups of workers are represented in social dialogue. And I can elaborate more later, but thank you.
Sabina, thank you so much for that, because what you've really done is brought to the surface the unique experience of many of the countries in the global south, and the importance for us to tune in to those challenges. Very much everything that you've said is also a reflection of what one observes here in South Africa. I mean, one of the things that you've said, and I think it links back to what Professor De Stefano said, at the end of his scene setting, Professor De Stefano said, social dialogue needs to go beyond its usual mandate. And this is exactly what you're talking about when you're inviting us to think about that deepening inequality, and that and what we're seeing in terms of social protection being linked to traditional work concepts, and what about the informal workers and the platform workers. And this is really about going beyond that Professor De Stefano is speaking about. So really important insights. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've got a couple of things that I need to get right before we get to the bottom of the hour. One of these is that I really want to bring a second question through to all of my panelists, but I also want to bring in the voice of the audience. So the likes of Malushka, who I know has been with us throughout the session, who's already sent a brilliant question, are some of those voices that I want to bring in. But in order to do that, I'm going to have to be tough. I'm going to have to ask my panelists to be super concise, super to the point, and really brief in the second round of questions, so that Malushka and our audience can have a share of voice here as well. So, Minister Nordmark, you're first up again. I'm going to come back to you for a question. You know, we know that collective bargaining is known to balance out unilateral decision-making in the workplace. And at the same time, it also offers solutions that are tailor-made to the situation of an individual business. The question, Minister, is, do you see this also being the case when it comes to bargaining collectively on managing the impact of digital techniques on the quality of jobs? Minister.
My answer is yes. Earlier this week, I visited a Swedish retailer in Dalarna in Sweden. The company has for a long period of time gone through a transition to automatization and AI in their delivery and shipping process. And in this transition, the company has involved the union and the workers. And this has built a trust in the change to new technology and also to working conditions, including training and education and so on. And I believe that this is the key. And I really agree on what also Professor De Stefano said, and also Esther Lynch, about the importance of to involve workers and the trade unions. And I think that it is really necessary to expand and develop the social dialogue, because social dialogue brings trust in the transition to new technology and to new jobs. because when you involve the workers in the process of change, you get both better results and safe workers who understand and embrace the change. So this is really the key if you want success. Thank you.
Minister, it's an excellent response, both in content, but also in how concise it was. Social dialogue, trust, inclusion, and buy-in is what I'm hearing you say. Minister Moroni, let me come to you. We know that in response to the pandemic, Minister, Argentina adopted a new law on remote working. Maybe just if you could share, Minister, what are the new measures in this law? What's new in this law? And what have been the role of the social partners in it? To you, Minister Moroni.
La ley es muy simple. La ley lo que intenta.
The new law is very simple. It tries to afford the same level of protection to workers at home than the one that they had when they went to their workplace. We recognize the reality that many people are working from home, but we have tried to maintain the same rights, including related to intimacy and privacy and caring for people at home, or compensation that may be paid to workers for a series of expenditures that they have that may have incurred to be able to work from home. We have included social dialogue in this, in that all of these principles, which are basic, have to be hashed out through collective bargaining. And so we trust in social dialogue, not only for the small print of the general principles enshrined in the law, but also for monitoring purposes, because we need to understand what type of programs and schemes the employers are using for this modality of work. Thank you.
Importance of social dialogue, creating the space to also monitor those commitments. It brings us very beautifully to some of the insights that came out of the conversation on due diligence yesterday. So there's a lot of alignment in your comments to what we heard yesterday. Jean-Pierre, let me circle back to you, because if we come back to the NG joint statement that you mentioned in your earlier intervention, I'm keen to understand, what does it say regarding the impact of digitalization on the quality of jobs? And do you have a concrete experience from applying that statement that perhaps you could share with us today? Jean-Pierre, if you could kindly unmute. Thank you, sir.
Sorry. No, in fact, probably the most obvious and most significant impact relates to training. NG is a company which is a leader in the energy transition. It's a field which is moving very, very quickly. We need very specific competencies, and for that, we need to train our employees. And I was very pleased to see that last year in 2020, 70% of our employees receive training or participated in a training, which in a year where we were in confinement in most of our countries for several months is a very good result. And the reason why we've been able to achieve such a high level of training is the fact that we have increased by about 300% the offering of digital training, which means that we have quadrupled the amount of training that we can offer through digital tools. And this is for us really a breakthrough. Once again, the pandemic has certainly accelerated the trend, but the objective for us is to go to 100% of our employees being trained, each of our employees being trained at least once during a calendar year. And for that, we need to use the digital tools very effectively. But another example, and I'll be very short, during this pandemic, when we had tens of thousands of employees working in home office, it was very important to make sure that no one was left behind, alone, facing a very challenging situation. And I think all of our leaders at the various levels of the organization have done a very, very good job, probably thanks to the support and the training that the company has given them, to make sure that they keep connected to each and every of the people in their own teams. And I'm not saying it has been perfect, but in these very specific circumstances, we've done really a lot, and it's recognized through surveys that we do regularly. It's recognized by our employees. We've done a lot to make sure that digital training, that digital working, home office, does not mean that everyone is left alone dealing with its own challenges. We think that the collective organization and the fact that we work as team is something which is indeed very important. And I think our managers at the various levels of the company have been able to use these digital tools very effectively to keep a form of collectivité de travail, I don't know how you say that in English, but which indeed was very effective.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre. I think connected work is the term, but thank you very much for sharing that those very practical examples. You know, when I reflect on just the last one and that imperative to leave no one behind and to ensure that social distancing doesn't mean social distance from each other, and that we can still remain connected. The opportunity, as I'm hearing, to deepen the culture or deepen team culture in particular by empowering managers with digital tools that allow them to keep their teams together are all very important parts of the world that we are navigating right now. Esther, let me bring your voice back into this conversation. And the question that I'd like to bring to you is how do you see your affiliates preparing for the impact of new digital technologies on the quality of jobs? I'm quite interested in knowing if there's one or two really good examples that you can share with us today.
Sure, I think it's important that we all learn from past mistakes. And one of the past mistakes was the data protection rules. The data protection rules have a safeguard, and the safeguard is that the individual has to consent before their data can be used. And what we have seen in the workplace is that individual consent is no safeguard whatsoever, because the individual doesn't have enough power. Most workers don't even read their contracts, let alone have enough power to renegotiate individual parts dealing with consent. And that's why it's so important when we're dealing with the introduction of artificial intelligence into the workplace, that we do not do that on the basis of if the individual says it's okay, then the employer can do whatever they want. And that's why we negotiated our agreement on digitalization. So this agreement is an EU-level blueprint for a fair digital change. And what this agreement says very clearly is that when it comes to the introduction of artificial intelligence, that should be with agreement, collective agreement with the unions, because they know what the human in control principle looks like in their workplace. Because in the past, robots were bolted to the ground or they were in cages, but in the future we're going to be interacting with them, and there is lots of artificial intelligence that workers want because it will keep them safe. But similarly, we have real concerns, particularly as Professor De Stefano said, like it's hard enough doing a day's work without having a camera on you all day saying, are you happy about doing it all day, every day? And I noticed it already. You check into a hotel room and you get up to your room and there's a little thing saying smiley face. How was your check-in? Was it happy? Was it sad? Or what are you? And I know that that the pressure on people to do their work now, it's not good enough that you do a good day's work now, but you have to be happy as you're going about it, and somebody else has to be happy in how you went about it. So it's time to call halt. It's time to call stop on a lot of this stuff. Time for reflection, and it's time to make sure that any of these tools, all of these tools, are only introduced in the workplace through collective agreement, because then you have the understanding that they are needed, that they are useful, and that nobody is fearful or damaged by them.
Esther, excellent provocations for us, and how powerful that you lift you know, an example that is probably all very close to us, this idea of data protection and highlighting the power dynamics that are at play. And so for us to be very clear around the gap sometimes that exists between our intention and the actual impact of how a policy or procedure plays out in the workplace. What I'm hearing even louder though, Esther, is the invitation to exercise courage to stop and to halt and to reflect. I don't think we're always very good at pausing to stop and to reflect. It's always easier to build something than it is to actually break down something. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Sabina, let me circle my way back to you again. Now, I want to bring global supply chains back into the conversation, Sabina. We know that reacting to the disruption the pandemic has inflicted on global supply chains, business is reported to be looking to rebalance efficiency and resilience by resorting more to automation and nearshoring production. The question to you, Sabina, is what are the consequences workers and suppliers in the global South? What are the consequences for workers and suppliers in the global South? And how can social dialogue mitigate this particular trend?
Thanks, Nosy, for that question. You know, there are around 97 million workers whose livelihoods are directly linked to global supply chains, and millions more if we include workers that are in ancillary sectors or in very elaborate fragmented supplier networks. So reshoring or nearshoring threatens what has been an important source of employment and growth for many countries, many developing countries that have for a while now capitalized on the availability of surplus low-cost labor. But let me be very clear, the decision on where to locate production is about more than just labor costs. And here I think social partners play a vital part in representing worker voice on various issues. So it's not just the wonderful work that national unions or international confederations do on transparency in supply chains or factory safety, as we saw in Bangladesh, for example, with the Rana Plaza collapse, but it's also the workers that represent rights, workers' unions that represent, you know, issues like wages or land rights, right? Because those are as much a part of the decision-making process in where production is located. And there are numerous examples of trade unions with support from regional and international trade union confederations that have conducted advocacy across forums, be that, you know, through the tripartite structure at the ILO, where we've seen, you know, much more stronger messages on the importance of instituting fair and just value chains, or in fighting transparency in the fishing sector in the Philippines, for example, or representing workers' rights in textile exporting sectors like in Bangladesh and India and other nations. So I think that there are numerous examples of where trade unions and social dialogue in particular have represented a number of issues that actually play into production decisions and can help not only institute fair practices and value chains, but also preserve the advantage that developing countries have and what they have to offer in the decisions that are made on where companies locate production. And the last sentence that I will say, Nosy, is just, I think one of the major challenges confronting social dialogue is also the asymmetries of power, right? So when we're talking about supply chains in particular, you know, multinational corporations have a lot of power over national suppliers and then the vast subcontracting and so on that goes on. And it's extremely important that we strengthen the voice of workers that are, you know, that are at the lower sort of value add portions of supply chains in these vast, complicated, fragmented supplier networks, and that social dialogue actually represent the voices of the most disenfranchised workers that are often women or informal sector workers. Mm-hmm. So I'll just end on that note. Thank you.
Sabina, it's excellent again, and I'm seeing a lot of alignment to especially the point on the asymmetries of power to what we heard from Esther as well, as she was, speaking to us about those power dynamics. But it's such an important conversation that you're bringing to the surface around, what are the decisions and the criteria that determine the location of production sites, and how do we ensure that social dialogue and trade unions and collective bargaining are part of enhancing the positive aspect of that decision-making process. Now, I must say that to my panelists, you all did an excellent job of being so concise in the second round of questions. I feel that I should have been even stricter in the first round, but the beautiful thing is that there's now a little bit of time for us to actually bring in some of our audience voice. And Professor De Stefano, you're still with us, so I'm going to bring this question to you. It comes from Cindy Berman from the Open Society Foundation. And Cindy says, excellent presentation by Valerio De Stefano, very clear analysis with implications and an agenda for action by all social dialogue partners. And the question then that she then brings, Professor, is what government and international level regulation is needed to address these issues that we've been speaking about? And how can rights and the protection of workers that voluntarily or involuntarily work outside of formal employment relationship, how can these be improved? Your thoughts on some of this, Prof?
Well, thank you very much for the questions. I think we can refer to the agreement that Esther Lynch was mentioning before. The European agreement on the digital transition can provide for a blueprint for governments and international organizations to act. Though that agreement can be transposed easily into national and international legislation in order to foster social dialogue in workplaces, and in particular, and I cannot stress this enough, in order to introduce a right to be informed and consulted, and in some cases also a right of co-determination in the introduction of AI at the workplace, particularly when AI is not used on production, but used on people. That kind of use of AI warrants extreme attention, and the best people who can warrant this attention are the unions and the HR managers and employers. We cannot leave it out to the programmers, to those who brand or market this software. It's something that needs to happen at the workplaces and at the sector.
Thank you very much, Professor De Stefano. And what I'm also hearing through that response is taking ownership of those technologies and the impact of those technologies, and not taking a laissez-faire attitude to say the developers and the marketers have good intention. Esther, there's an interesting question from Malushka Rakami. She is an advisor at Social Economic Council in Curacao and has been one of our most active global audience members of this week. And the question is, besides empowering participants, what can partners in the social dialogue do to stimulate workers to take up lifelong learning? Question from Malushka.
So one of the biggest challenges to take up training that workers face is when the training is actually on, are you at work? So number one is that the training should be available during work time or through some flexibility in terms of your work time. The second challenge in terms of getting workers to take up the training is that they're not convinced that the value of the training will actually help them progress to the next stage of their career. And so it needs to be very clear that the value of the certificate of the training, the value of the qualification that you're going to get. And then the third challenge is the cost of training. So for a lot of workers, particularly if you're in the middle of a change management process, you're fearful of what's about to happen. So you don't want to eat into your savings to pay 10 or 20,000 for a training course or anything like it. And if you're a minimum wage worker, you haven't got any savings. So the cost of training, the cost of getting there, all of that being critically important as well. And then the final piece I would say is that we need to make absolutely sure that workers have sufficient baseline education to be able to engage in the training as well. And for some sectors, some parts of the world, that's important. And then just very, very finally, just because I always throw this point in there, is that for a lot of workers, the world of education was not a pleasant place. And they had bad experiences when they were young. And we need to recognize that and acknowledge that and develop champions from working communities who talk about second chance and third chance education and are willing to come forward. I'm a person who had second chance education. I got my law qualification at night when I was in my 20s. I could never have done it when I was a young woman. So I think it's really important to talk, you know, for those of us who had second and third chance, who come from working communities, you know, to be very clear about that it's never too late, it's never too hard, and really to give people the chance is a wonderful thing.
Esther, thank you so much. You've just reminded me of my own personal experience. My mother became a teacher at the age of 54. And so second and third chances indeed. But what I'm also hearing you saying, which is so important, and it's also true in the South African context, the importance of baseline education, because what tends to happen is that the workers who have a higher level of education are the ones who are most primed and ready for the skilling opportunities, and those without the basic numeracy and literacy just get left behind. So very, very important. Jean-Pierre, let me bring this question from Cambodia. Munyosevan Priap from Cambodia, a trade union leader, is bringing this question to us. And the question is, in the context of global supply chains, how can we mobilize social dialogue to get employers and brands to the table to negotiate social protection of workers? Your thoughts on that, Jean-Pierre?
Well, I think if it's within one organization, it's pretty easy. The difficulty is when you want to go into your supply chain. There we have at NG, and I'm sure that other large groups have the same approach. We have a way to evaluate our suppliers when it comes to sustainability and related issue, and the quality, the existence and the quality of the social dialogue is one criteria that we use when we do this type of evaluation of supplier. It can be very complex in some geographies. I'm not saying it's something which is easy, but we are really trying to make sure that our own commitments and are shared by our key suppliers.
Fantastic. Sabina's got an addition to that comment. Jean-Pierre, Sabina, go for it.
Great, thank you so much, Nosy. I just wanted to say that, you know, social dialogue mechanisms are somewhat more developed in the global north and in Europe in particular, where there's a long history and you know, of a social compact relative to the global south. And this means that if we want to see productive change in supply chains, whether it be transparency or better rights or better wages or working conditions, the trade unions in the global north have to exert pressure on the multinationals in their countries that then outsource production to the global south. And there's numerous examples of that happening, which I think are worthy of note. And this has to be supplemented on the other side with support, which I've already talked about, supporting national trade unions to build evidence-based campaigns, to rectifying the asymmetries of power so that this heterogeneous group of workers' voices are represented you know, at the national level to their governments and to their suppliers at the national level. So I think we kind of need to work on both ends. And you know, given more time, I would talk about these examples, but you know, both in the global north with the trade unions there, but also at the national levels in the global south supporting national trade building.
And I see Jean-Pierre nodding as you're speaking, Sabina. So I think there's a lot of congruence between what you're saying and he's agreeing to it. I want to squeeze in two quick questions to our ministers before we wrap up. Minister Moroni, I'd like to come to you first. let's talk about vulnerable workers, especially women in global supply chains that have very little access to smartphones and little access to the internet. How can social dialogue not only support the digital transition, but also increase the level of access to digital tools? Minister, the question comes from Beverly Hall from the Ethical Trade Initiative.
Bueno, básicamente lo que estamos impulsando desde el
What we
gobierno.
are trying to push for from our government is different programs to hire women and diverse groups. So we have quotas for specific sectors, and this is something we negotiate sector by sector. In the building sector, for example, we have profiles that can be occupied by women, and we're giving training funded by the government for that. We are reproducing those systems sector by sector because we understand that to have an efficient integration, we need to define profiles first. So this is what we do. We give some specific incentives to hiring through the reduction of some taxes, etc. And we also promote training. In Argentina, young, poor women are the most affected by unemployment. They have a 3 times higher rate of unemployment. This is why we're having a positive action policy.
Minister, thank you very much. It's a fantastic insight, sector by sector, incentives, and making sure that you understand the vulnerable groups within the labor market. Minister Nordmark, as we close off, here's a question from Sophie Mardal. And Sophie says, this panel has focused on how social dialogue can support the design of human-centered digitalization and artificial intelligence. But what about the other way around? How can social dialogue facilitate and promote the implementation of these new technologies in the workplace? Question for you, Minister Nordmark.
Thank you. And thank you for the question.
Es que lo que nosotros estamos incentivando en materia de
what we're trying to incentivize in terms of social dialogue in the workplace is what we introduced with the new remote work law. We have a certain series of parameters, but the contract itself will depend on collective bargaining. There will not be an individual remote work contract, but it will depend on collective bargaining. It will be covered by collective bargaining. Regarding rights, we wanted to make sure that we protected the individual rights of the worker in the company and also the rights of at the same level, working from home, as all the other workers in the company, regardless of where they work from. But the contract can only be applied if there is a prior collective bargaining approach.
Same question to Minister Nordmark as well. Minister, your thoughts on this question that has come from Sophie.
Thank you, Nosy. My experience also from being a trade union leader in Sweden for 20 years, my experience is that through social dialogue, you can also promote structural change, and you can promote new and better jobs. And that is actually key now when we have to build back better after the pandemic, but also create new green jobs. So this is really my experience. And I just want to finally underline also the importance of not only the existence of social dialogue, but also a dialogue of quality. And upholding quality and trust in the dialogue requires constant work and is particularly important in a phase of transition where the labor market goes through major changes as now. So thank you.
Yeah. Minister, I think it's an excellent way to close off our conversation. If you've been following, you would notice that we try to close it off in a fun way every day. So here's the challenge that I'd like to put to everyone. The team is going to have to come up with a report. Esther put up a report earlier on her screen. She was showing us her report. The team's going to have to put up a report on the back of this session. They need a title for the report, and I'm asking you to help us. Not an executive summary, not a chapter, just a title, just a few words that capture the essence of this conversation. I'm going to help you out, and I'm going to say it has to start with social dialogue, and then you get to complete the sentence with social dialogue. So I'm trying to see who looks the most confident. Minister Nordmark, you have a look of confidence on your face. Let's give you the first shot, shot at this. With social dialogue, Minister Nordmark.
You protect people, not jobs.
Fantastic. I think that certainly is going to be a really excellent one. Professor Di Stefano, not a thesis, not a dissertation, just a cover of a report with social dialogue?
With social dialogue, you protect people.
Right to the point. With social dialogue, you protect people. So we have a variation, people and not jobs and just people. Minister Moroni, let me go to you, sir. With social dialogue.
Desarrollamos la comunidad.
We develop our communities.
With social dialogue, we develop our communities. I don't think that one is going to, is such a good one. I hope that we're going to be able to beat it. I'm not sure. Jean-Pierre, you're looking very confident. Let's hear from you.
No, I would say with social dialogue, you make your company more effective.
With social dialogue,
perform better, let's say. You make your company perform better.
You make your company perform better, even better. Sabina, let's come to you. With social dialogue?
With social dialogue, excuse me, with social dialogue, we build just economies and a people-centered world.
We build just economies and a people-centered world. I can almost see the team writing this down for the report. Esther, you get to take us home with social dialogue.
You can have the courage to change.
You've got my heart. A social dialogue, you can have the courage to change. A massive thank you to all of you, to, of course, Professor Di Stefano, Minister Moroni, Minister Nordmark, Sabina Dawan, Esther Lynch, Mr. Jean-Pierre Clamadieu. Thank you so very much. With that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you to the audience for your really excellent questions. It's my absolute pleasure right now to hand over to the Deputy Secretary General of the OECD, Mr. Ulrich Knudsen, who's online with us to extend his closing remarks and reflections as we begin to wrap up our time together. Mr. Knudsen, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, ministers, distinguished speakers, dear participants. We will try to look back at this first annual Global Deal High-Level Social Dialogue Forum. That's the full title. I was very impressed with the titles you suggested for the report. They're actually more meaningful and shorter than the full title of this meeting. So I've learned a bit about communication. It's been a very rich set of discussions over the last 4 days, and I'll just take this opportunity to share the key takeaways for us at the Secretariat with you. But before doing so, I cannot address you without echoing what Minister Nordmark said and pay tribute to Richard Trumka, the AFL-CIO president from 2009 to 21. I met him many times, and he really did devote his life to the trade union movement, and he was a great source of inspiration to all of us. He attended many OECD meetings in his capacity of president of TUAC, and we will always remember his passion and dedication to workers' rights. Coming back to the forum, my first takeaway is that in thinking about labor market recovery, we must aim for more than simply returning to the old normal. We should instead aim to ensure that the labor markets actually do emerge stronger from the crisis, that they work more effectively. Jean-Pierre mentioned companies to work effectively. We need labor markets to work effectively, and of course also more resilient to future shocks. Second, the message coming out of each session, very loud and clear, I think, is that social dialogue will be fundamental in achieving this better normal. And I'll give you a few examples of why. One reason is that we have to reinforce inclusion, and that's what social dialogue does. It can foster a broad sharing of the benefits of labor market recovery and notably help reach workers who are in vulnerable positions. Another point, a second point, is that social dialogue can make global supply chains more resilient to shocks by advancing job quality at the local level and by pushing for responsible purchasing practices with pricing that allows suppliers to pay a living wage and social insurance. For example, in August, major brands and global union federations renewed the Accord for Fire and Building Safety. This is actually an accord that provides concrete binding measures to improve worker safety in the garment sector in Bangladesh based on social dialogue. A third reason is that social dialogue reinforces the power of OECD risk-based due diligence to promote decent work worldwide. To identify, prevent, and mitigate risks in global supply chains, businesses need trusted local partners and local buy-in. Businesses need to listen to and cooperate with workers and trade unions to know what is happening on the ground and communicate on actions they're taking to address issues that are raised. Finally, and as we've heard in this particular session, social dialogue institutions are important to shape the introduction of new technologies, not least artificial intelligence. I saw there were also questions in the chat about this. And we have to do this in ways that are balanced, that are pragmatic and also effective. Social dialogue can contribute to smoother implementation of these technologies in the workplace, while ensuring at the same time that benefits and costs are fairly distributed across different stakeholders. Just as example, we heard from Jean-Pierre Clamadieu and his company, how they have mobilized social dialogue to better prepare both the company and its workforce for digital change. So we're 1 minute from the end, so let me close by saying that I think this conference has made it clear that social dialogue is an essential tool to address labor market challenges successfully. This is why the OECD, as a partner to the Global Deal, will continue to promote and support effective social dialogue. I strongly encourage more governments, more trade unions, and especially perhaps more businesses to join the Global Deal partnership. The partner sessions over these 4 days testify to the commitment to furthering social dialogue, and I want to thank all of you for your profound engagement, and my heartfelt thanks also go to all the speakers and participants, and of course you, moderator, back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Knudsen. Ladies and gentlemen, there's nothing more to say other than to say goodbye and thank you. I hope that you enjoy what's left of the week, but certainly that you take these conversations and plant them back in your respective spaces so that they germinate into seeds of stronger and more resilient social dialogue. From myself, Nozipho Shabalala, it's thank you and goodbye.